Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of The Career Climb. We did take a few weeks off due to travel and weather impacts. If anyone lives in Houston, you know the drama we've experienced. But we are back, and I'm excited to be here. So, on The Career Climb, we spark conversations with industry leaders, executives, and professionals, and we get their perspectives on the career landscape, leadership, and workplace culture. And tonight, we have a global HR leader on the show with us, Mr. Dan Roth. But if this is your first time tuning in, I am your host, Julia Roth, founder and CEO at Roth Career Development, and I'm excited that you are here. And I would love for you to stay engaged with us in the chat. Let us know what city and state you're watching from. Let us know what hits home for you. Let us know how awesome we are. Whatever it is that you want to share, we want to hear it from you. And also, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We want to make sure that this is a lively, interactive discussion. And since we have an expert with us, we want to get your questions addressed. But we're going to get going because I'm really excited for you guys to meet our special guest, Dan Roth. But before we get into the conversation, if you've watched The Career Climb before, you know that I give my guests their full formal introduction. So let me share Dan's bio with you. So Dan Roth is an award-winning, internationally recognized recruiter, DEI program manager, professional speaker, TV show producer, and influencer. Over the last 3 years, Dan has been recognized as one of the top 25 job search experts to follow on LinkedIn by JobScan. He has also been featured in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Business Insider, the South African Times, LinkedIn News, CNBC, and the Business Journal. And as we're talking about mental health, I'm going to share this part, Dan. Shortly after graduating high school, Dan started to use his lived experiences with anxiety and depression and being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder at an early age to educate others on what growing up neurodiverse is like in order to normalize these conversations and let others know that they are not alone. His mental health focus continues to be a theme, even as he's expanded his work to include diversity, equity, and inclusion, women's and disability rights, as well as supporting job seekers. Dan, hello, my friend. Welcome to
Oh man, that bio just comes out so smoothly out of your mouth. It makes me seem so much greater than I am. I appreciate you. When you reached out, it was an absolute honor and, quite frankly, a privilege to be asked by you, somebody that I've had so much respect, love, and admiration for a long time. It's one of those things that you don't expect it, and then when you hear it, it's like, oh wow. So I'm truly honored.
I'm just so happy. I'm happy that you accepted my invite. I was like, I'm gonna ask and see if he says yes. So thank
Like,
you for being here.
how could I honestly? How could I not? You've helped so many people and set such a great example, and just with the understanding I have of how scrutinized mental health is, especially within the Black community, for you to stand there and speak out about it, you're setting an example for an entire culture that really needs to be dived into more. So, you know, thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you so much. And so we want to go ahead and hop in. And well, first, before we get into the topic about mental health, because like you said, this is a powerful topic that we need to get into. But I want to set the stage a little bit for our viewers and listeners. Can you share a little bit more about your career journey and how you've gotten to this point in your career today, on the HR side, but also when it comes to mental health?
My career journey has been messed up. Like, people talk about job hopping. Uh, the thing about growing up neurodiverse is that in school there's such a high level of focus on the actual work that the social takes a back seat, and then at a certain point the social comes first, and the academic and the job takes a back seat. And that's what happened to me. I graduated with a degree in journalism and worked as a managing editor, but I didn't really care much about what I was doing, and did the retail thing. um, and eventually I made my way out to California, where I now am. And within a week of being here, I met my now wife. And it wasn't until I met her and I started having a reason to really focus in, and somebody that supported me and that and really built me up, that I was able to focus. But it wasn't like it wasn't immediate, and I don't want anybody to think it was. It took a long time to get where I was. I went from, I moved out here making $7.25 an hour working at Petco, to going into contract work and working at Hotel del Coronado, and then uh, Time Warner Cable, AT&T, and then little by little I started improving, and then I got to a place where within 3 years I went from making like $25,000 a year to 150 plus,
Woo.
working at the top company arguably in the world. um, and really the impetus on that was at 35 years old when my kids were born. That gave me my firm why, and uh, then I started accepting who I am, what I do best, and that was a dramatic and clear upward trajectory. So there's a lot to it, and way more than we have time for right now. But it's not like my story's not out there. If you want to check out my profile, I've got like something like 50 newsletter articles out, and then things, and videos. And so there's a lot to it. Sorry, I'm not short in knowing. I've been asked this a million times. I never know how to answer it concisely.
But that's okay. I mean, I think, man, I feel like we need to have a whole other conversation as to making that transition from the 25K to the 150K in 3 years. That we're gonna have to stick a pin in that and come back to that for another live stream.
I'll tell you, that was partly luck and a lot of extremely hard work. When I stepped out and said, "Hi, I'm Dan, I'm neurodiverse," and I started putting myself first, I started figuring things out. And the reason I got a job at Amazon was not because I was the best recruiter. It wasn't because I had the most credentials. It's because I figured out what my unique value proposition was.
Mm.
And being a community builder and being able to bring people in is such a novel trait right now, that stood out, and that's what Amazon really clung on to. But it's one thing to get in the door, it's another thing once you're there on what are you going to do with it. And the best work of my life I did was when that door opened.
Man, I love that. And I know that we're needing to get on the mental health conversation, but I think it's really important that you emphasize how much hard work you had to put in, not just to get in the door, but then also how do you maintain those opportunities? How do you grow? How do you capitalize on it? Because the door can open, but if you're not ready or willing to do all the work that's required to keep you there and to keep the opportunities coming, you may not be as successful. So no, I love that. So let's go ahead and hop in. So I want to get your perspective on this as a scene set. Why do you think it's so important for us to talk about mental health in the context of the job search, right? We can talk about mental health all day long in broad conversations, but when it comes to the job search, why do you think it's important for us to talk about it there as well?
Well, as you said, I believe it's important to talk about mental health every day of our lives and every component of our lives. And that doesn't just start in job search. It starts as a parent, teaching my kids that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay to have bad days, it's okay to be depressed. Uh, Within the job search, and this is going to go into a larger dynamic, we are not in the same place that we were 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people were still in their positions for a long time. One of the key areas that's made it hypercritical is that the pandemic put an enormous amount of people in debt. And then people saw certain industries that were perceived as stable. So they started changing and going to boot camps and started doing all this other kind of stuff. But by the time that they got done with those boot camps, they realized that, wait a second, now the market is changing and the competition in those fields is so much more difficult. So they just spent thousands upon thousands of dollars that they didn't have on top of the debt that they're in because of the pandemic to change fields where they've never been, only for the market to sort of revert itself a little bit. Then the recession happens, and these same people who are just starting to pick up the pieces are now going into double debt.
Mm.
So, how do you get out of it? How do you feel about it? Because this is a lot. It's not like you're getting knocked off a perch one time. It's this repeated, uh, these repeated punches that keep on happening. And that's where it becomes one of those situations where before there may have been a linear path to solution, whereas now it more is a proactive measure of how can we prepare ourselves the best while knowing that we're still going to have a difficult time. And part of that is having those mental health conversations and looking at it from a very early point. Well, if I do get laid off, what are my systems going to be? Who am I going to talk to? Who do I have available? Because we all have those feelings of, if I talk to one person too much, then I'm putting the burden on them. And we don't ever want to do that. And that often leads to ourselves being inclusive and keeping things to ourselves, which is not good either. So it's this combat of emotions that we're dealing with. And one of the things that doesn't get spoken about nearly enough, and this is where I'll kind of turn it back over to you, is the fact that when we're in a job search, it's not just affecting us, it's affecting our kids and especially our spouses if we're in relationships.
Mm.
And a lot of times, and I'll speak about my personal experience, knowing what is happening and the burden that my job search is placing on my wife, I feel horrible and don't always feel like I can go to her because I want to be respectful of the emotions that she's dealing with. And that creates, like, the one person you're supposed to be able to speak to, you feel almost ashamed to speak to about these things. So it isn't just affecting the job seeker, it's affecting the spouse. And that's where those multiple complications really need to get put out in the open as much as possible.
No, I love the fact that you're highlighting the impact on just beyond you, right? Because it's not just you trying to find a job and figure yourself out. Like you said, if you've got a family that you're providing for, a spouse, that's a lot of weight on you as an individual. And like you said, if you can't offload that to the person you would normally offload that to, you're probably internalizing a lot of it. And the question is, where do you go? And so I think it's really important that, especially if someone who's listening, who is on the job search right now, finding the spaces that you can actually offload or be able to share, whether it's a therapist, a counselor, a confidant, so that you're not carrying all this weight with you on your journey, because it makes things really difficult. And so speaking of some of the mental health challenges, because I know that you work with job seekers, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing most with job seekers because obviously when we talk about the market now, it's like it's all doom and gloom, no one's hiring, the sky is falling. So when you talk to job seekers now, what are some of the mental health kind of concerns that you're seeing them bringing to you?
That's a complicated question, because it's easier to say there's not an aspect of it that is not coming to me. And I think the biggest thing is, in this market, you look and it's hard not to take things personally. You're
Mm.
watching 3,000, 5,000 people applying for the same roles, and you're sitting there knowing what you bring to the table. And it's a lot for whatever reason, it's easier to justify when we're making mistakes. It's a lot harder to reason within ourselves when we're doing everything we can, when we're preparing the best we can, when we're going through, we're getting our resume updated, we're doing the outreach, we're doing the networking, we're doing all this, we're doing all that. And then it comes down to uh, uh, partially luck, partially timing, and recognizing that I may be homeless tomorrow, but that doesn't mean I've done anything wrong today.
Right.
That's a really difficult concept. Um, and it's one that doesn't offer a solution.
And I guess that my question would be kind of piggybacking on that, because like you said, you're doing, for a lot of people, they're doing everything right. They're putting themselves out there, they're networking. And so I want to go back to something you said earlier about things not being the same way they were 5 years ago. So when you think about job seekers that you may have worked with prior to the pandemic and then now, what are the big differences that you're seeing? Because everyone says, I feel like it was easier to get a job back then versus today. And so just wanted to see if you're seeing some of the same issues, or are they completely different in terms of how people are feeling in their job search?
I think people have short-term memories. A lot of people are comparing everything to the boom that happened during the pandemic, but that was an anomaly. That
Mm.
wasn't necessarily the average reality of the situation. And I don't necessarily see a tremendous amount of difference when
Mm.
we look at now versus maybe 10 years ago as compared to now versus five. Like 5 years ago, everybody's getting hired under the sun. Uh, Companies are competing with other companies to hire. Like, it was this windfall of money, but history repeats itself. And if we then look back at it from before that, well, what are the standard methodologies that we're going to use? Yeah, there have been a couple of resume updates and new technology. There's AI, which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of in some veins. Uh, but the actual process is not very different. The networking, the community building, and everything like that. So I don't necessarily know that it's tremendously different. Even if you look at the decrease in HR and you call it DEI, I call it humanity work roles because of the negative connotation and sort of the anti-Black rhetoric going on within the term DEI. But with those roles being eliminated, like that's still no different than it was before. It was just, companies were putting on a show.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, because to your point, everyone thought that what was happening during the pandemic and all these remote roles and all these tech companies hiring, it's like, it's the land flowing with milk and honey, and we kind of make that the new kind of average or standard. And it's like, well, that really wasn't the standard. It was a moment in time. And when we really kind of look at things maybe further out and look at things further back, it's like it's not really all that different just yet. So even though folks will say there is, with technology and AI, that there is some difference there, but I appreciate that context. So I do want to ask, you mentioned, some of the anti-Black rhetoric when it comes to DEI, and I wanted to speak to that a little bit, just like even in the context of current events. For those who may be watching, you may have heard about the murder of Sonia Massey, and you see these events that are happening kind of in the world around us. And then, you have Black and brown folks who are in the job search, and so they're seeing what's happening in the community in a societal perspective, and they still have to try to show up and give their best and try to get jobs in companies and so forth. So I wanted to know what your thoughts were about how that can impact job seekers on their search when they're dealing with these kind of world events as well.
Well, I'm going to expand it to talking about culture of companies, and I'll tell you a quick anecdote. Uh, Back when the top shooting happened in Buffalo, um, I remember talking to John Graham Jr., who's a friend of mine and a bit of a mentor. And I remember him saying, Dan, um, these corporations need to stop treating this as just another day. It's not just another day. And I remember hearing that and really sitting with it and realizing, you know what? You're right. Companies don't skip a beat when things happen. And that's not okay. If you're a job seeker, if you're a Black job seeker, or you're somebody from a marginalized community, or if you're somebody that went to a school where there was a shooting, when you come back to work following those events, you are not going to have a clear mind or mentality. It's natural not to have it. We need to stop pretending that it is just another day.
Mhm.
So we need to allow people time to grieve and understand. And honestly, as a job seeker, if I were to say, hey, here's a list of questions I wish I could get honestly answered, one of them would be, when something happens, how did the company react like that?
Mm. Mm.
Because that to me is symbolic of, is this a human-centered organization? Now, I'll tell you something. What was ironic about that situation, and sort of to close the loop on that about the top shooting, um, is I had a coworker that day, and she was not okay. And I spent maybe half of the day talking with her and just being there as a voice, or even just like on a call where we may not have been talking, because I knew that she needed support, and I knew that the recognition needed to be made that it was different. And what was following up on that, what was ironic, is that then 2 weeks later, I got a message from Jackie Abram, who's an author, and she asked me to interview Mark Talley, whose mother was killed in the top shooting.
Mhm.
And that brought a whole nother weight. Now, how do you respond when you're dealing with this dynamic, and you watch what's happening? Because it's important. We can't brush it to the side. We need to acknowledge the occurrences of what's going on. And uh, we talked about this a little bit offline, but Sonia Massey, today is not just another day.
Yeah.
Um, I I'm tired of society making excuses. George Floyd happened, and everybody tried to make a believer that we're going up in DEI, but nothing actually happened if we go to where we are now, because now we have another incident of the same sort. And who's going to believe that tomorrow is going to be any different? That has got to be one of the most difficult things for people to grapple with. And what's perhaps the worst part of that is, you don't want to go into work because you're at danger, but then if you stay home, you're also at danger. So where do you go? Where do you create a safe space for yourself? Um, and that's something that really hits me in a heavy place.
Yeah, I mean, and I think about that as being a Black woman in America, and think about Sonia Massey, and then just all the others we can name, Sandra Bland, all the others. And like you said, there was a commitment at a time where it's like, hey, we're going to change in organizations, we're focused on DEI, and then fast forward to 2024, we're rolling back the programs and wanting to call it something else because we think it's polarizing. And so I love the idea of, if you're in the job search, or you're asking questions, getting the answer as to, hey, if this happens, how does your organization respond? What is your go-to? Because if it's like, well, we just, we acknowledge and we move forward, it's like, okay, so how centered are you, or how focused are you on your population and what they may be experiencing, knowing that people are coming from these backgrounds and are identifying with the people that this is happening to. And like you said, these are things we can't brush under the rug. We have to confront them in order for the society to change. And again, from a mental health perspective, in order for you to really help your colleague at work, help a job seeker, whatever it might be, you have to make sure that you're holding space and acknowledging what's going on versus just trying to say, well, it's another day, because we become desensitized as a community. So thank you
And
for digging into that.
just to give people real advice on what they can do in those situations, a recruiter is not going to give you a direct answer to that question. This is where informational interviews are so positive, but also what I would be doing personally is I would ask a recruiter if they could connect me to somebody at the ERG that you would be, the employee resource group that you'd be part of, because that's where you're going to get a way more accurate representation. So with Amazon, it was the Black Employee Network. I'll say hi to Sharita Washington, who is the former president of Amazon's and one of my best friends in the world. That's where you're really going to get the right information. So it's not just about asking questions, it's about asking the right questions to the right people. And I understand from a mental health perspective, every time that you think about, well, I need to do an extra step, it feels extemporaneous. But for your own psychological safety, it's better to take those extra steps than to sit wondering, well, if I had gotten the information, what would have actually happened?
Mm, I love that. And like you said, it's practical. What can I do? Where can I actually get the answers to these questions? And like you said, you're not just waiting for the interview for the job. Talking to other people and getting connected to the people who actually have the information are going to give you the real deal, instead of just like what's on the company website about our values, right? Like somebody's just reading off a cue card. You want the person who can actually give you the real answer, give you real insight and context as to what you'll experience. So I love that. So I want to shift and ask you kind of the question around, what are, if for the job seekers that are listening, how can they truly protect and manage their mental health while on this journey? What actionable strategies, do you want to share? And also kind of in connection to that, how can you start to recognize the signs that you may be struggling with something? I know when I was depressed at work, I first thought I was failing. I was just like, I'm just not myself. I'm just not doing as well as I should. I need to work harder, not realizing that I was just becoming more and more depressed. So just wanted to see if you had some strategies there.
Yeah. My answer is going to be one of the most difficult things that people can do, and that is to advocate for yourself.
Mm,
You know, being a neurodiverse individual, and there's still so much misinformation out there about neurodiversity. There's bias everywhere. So for me to sit there and say, hey, and ask for accommodations is taking a risk. It shouldn't be that way. We should be able to present our best selves, and that's not what we're allowed to do. And even, I talk about this all the time, but let's say that you need an accommodation, whether you're disabled, whether you're neurodiverse, whatever the case may be. Well, the recruiter may not know exactly what the accommodation is, but they'll know that there is an accommodation because based on whatever you need if the interview is different. So even if they're not knowing, there's still a certain level of bias that's associated with it. On top of advocation within your mental health, and the reality is we don't always know when we're hitting that brick wall.
yeah.
Let's not pretend that we do. Like there's subtle signs, but that's where community and family is most important. A lot of people brush off when you have a family member say, hey, I noticed that you're a little more irritable today, or you just seem to be off your game. It sounds like something that's normal coming out of people's mouths, but the truth is, if you sit with that information a little bit and ask yourself, well, why is that? And you're honest with yourself about, well, maybe I'm overtired. So you get some rest the next night, but the next day you're still feeling that way. Well, now we need to get more in depth. We're just having a conversation, or not being afraid of going to therapy. Now, I understand that for some people, that's not always an option. And the reason I say it's not always an option is because I think the stats, and I may be wrong on the exact numbers, but less than 8% of psychiatrists in the United States are come from marginalized communities, specifically Black community. So I understand that finding somebody that can relate to what you're going through isn't always a viable option, but there still should be somebody that you could express yourself with, that you can pitch things off of. And I just don't. It's a hard question to answer in full because everybody's different. Um, I I'm just having to. I'm having a tough time because it shouldn't be this hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I'm happy with the answer, and I just appreciate you, you know, being vulnerable about that, and just being vulnerable during this whole conversation. You know, we have to do what we can, right? And so, like you said, if you're able to get therapy, if that's an opportunity to take advantage of that, but also making use of your circle, whether it's family, friends, you know, perhaps you have a religious leader that you can confide in, really just tapping into those who are around you. And if you need accommodations in your job search process, or when you're thinking about joining an organization, being willing to speak up for that, and not just hoping that you get in and then trying to figure it out after. And Sonia actually made a point here. Hey, Sonia, thanks for joining. It's very important that organizations have a safe space for employees to grieve, not just sending them to a space, but managers actively supporting staff, addressing these emotional issues openly and honestly during the interview process and with present employees. I love that so much, Sonia. Um,
One quick thing I wanted to mention, because I owe it to my wife to mention this, is when it comes to mental health, I don't want to forget about those individuals that are that are pregnant and going through childbirth, postpartum. Uh, some states have laws that make it easier, but even in those states where you're supposed to have a birthing suite on site, like with my wife's work, they cleaned out a closet for her to go into after, and it made me absolutely livid. It's one of the most, oh, uh, uh, I have not gotten that angry in my life. But also menopausal individuals, because those are also extremely stressful times, and men especially have not taken the time to understand the idiosyncrasies of it. And we're no longer at a place where it's okay to say, oh, that's gross, that's not my responsibility to know. No, it is your responsibility to know, because we are human beings and we need to do better at being there for each other. So, these are also things that could strongly affect the mental health and need to be accounted for. Uh, and it shouldn't be a situation where you have a woman or somebody that's menopausal that goes to their male boss and they go, walk it off. Like, obviously I'm stretching that a little bit, but you understand what I'm saying.
yeah.
So I just want to be cognizant of those specific areas.
Yeah, I love that, you know, to make sure that it's not just focusing on, yes, mental health is important in certain areas, and, you know, whether it's societal events or what have you, but just the life events that we are going through, just thinking about women, right? Whether it's childbirth, like you said, menopausal, all those things can impact how you function, your mental function, your mental health, how you show up every day. And so, having leaders who are seeking to be sensitive in that way is so important. I think people talk about leadership and about being the boss and getting into a certain position, but the fact is, true leadership is being willing to listen and understand your people, understand where they're coming from, what are they dealing with, being sensitive, and creating a space, the way that Sonia is mentioning, creating spaces for people to grieve, for them to deal with their issues, to bring them forward. So definitely love that angle. And then Sonia added one more point. The interviewee seeking a new position might want to go on the potential employer website to see if they have published mental health support information. That's a great point. You know, because they usually have their values posted in some way, whether it's sustainability or whatever the case is. So you may want to check out the website to see if they also talk about supporting people from a life perspective, including mental health. So thanks for that point, Sonia. Really appreciate it. And so I wanted to ask you a question now around, we talked a little bit about how companies can support, but I want to dig into this a little bit more as to how companies and organizations can truly support job seekers. We talked about creating spaces, but are there any, if there are employers that are listening or leaders that are listening, what are tangible things that you think from your perspective that they can really do to better support job seekers as well as those who are in their organization in this process?
This is where you're going to see my tone change
Uh-oh.
from mental health positive to like really critical.
Okay.
Because I don't think that companies are doing a very good job at all. I don't think that recruiters are being trained right. I think the entire process uh, is donkey backwards. I'm trying to be respectful of keeping cursing out. Uh, you know, right now companies are more focused on culture fit than culture add. And culture
Mhm.
fit, for those that are unfamiliar, is when you're trying to find basically a carbon copy of everybody that's already inside your organization. Culture add is when you're actively looking for somebody that brings something new to the organization. And when you have something, when you prioritize culture add, it gives people the ability to embrace their uniqueness and embrace what they bring to the table that others don't. The recruitment process needs to be more inclusive and handled with more delicate care. If somebody doesn't feel comfortable being on video, they shouldn't have to be on video. If somebody wants to be on video, they can be on video. If somebody doesn't do well with written 60-minute timed exams, there should be alternative methodologies for figuring out if a person is good for the role. There's barriers of entry that increase the gender and racial wealth gap that don't need to be there, including the prioritization of degrees that may have no effect on the job.
Mhm.
There are so many aspects and things that organizations can do. Another example is guaranteeing diverse panels during interviews. I can't tell you how many times it's been a 5 white people on panels with whatever the case may be. So how do we do that? How do we make sure teams are more inclusive? How do we make people feel more at home? uh, there is there's so much in the way that we can really work on. Accommodation should not be a big deal. And if you get me started on this entire return to work thing, we're going to be here for a long time.
Roll up our sleeves and get comfortable.
Because here's the deal. The data shows that people could only be at full capacity for about 88 minutes before needing a 20-minute break. So if you're talking about the standard 9 to 5, you're really not getting people for their full potential during that. So we no longer need to have these mandates. It doesn't make any sense. What about the mother of children that wants to be working and is a fantastic employee but can't get to the office because they need to be there and they can't afford the hour-long commute? There are so many things that just say to me, this return to work mandate is just plain stupid. Um, that it's yeah, this is one of those things that you're either gonna love what I'm saying or you're gonna hate what I'm saying. And I've been told not to say I don't apologize for my feelings, but in this case, I I don't apologize for my feelings.
Oh, I mean, but that's the purpose of this, is to have an open and honest conversation. And to the point that you're making, if organizations provide some of these alternatives, some of these accommodations for people who are already kind of stressed in the job search process, just trying to find an opportunity, trying to get through the 12 different interviews, by at least seeing that your culture and your organization is welcoming and is open and people centered. It at least gives you a little bit of hope in the process to say, hey, there's something worth it at the end of this, versus jumping through all these hoops and then you may not be treated well by the time you get into that organization. And honestly, you have the human focus, but I think this is also just good business, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're treating your employees well, you're providing these alternatives, people are going to be happier at work. They're going to be more productive. You're going to attract the right type of talent, people who want to bring their skills and insights and perspectives to the organization. That's only going to help you do better as a company. So it's not just about being woo woo and people focused. That's part of it, but it's good for your bottom line as an organization. So
Yeah.
I love
And
that.
I'll tell you, the reason I started working from home is because I got so stressed out at work
Mm.
that I developed overactive bladder and I was running to the bathroom every 5 minutes.
Oh no.
And it was because I constantly felt like people were looking over my shoulder at being micromanaged. And that's just not fair to put people through. Everybody is different. Everybody has heightened level of sensitivities. Uh, and the other component of it is when we do these return to work mandates and people are driving an hour, well, you may be paying them for 8 hours, but they're spending 2 hours on the road. How is that fair? They're expected to go above and beyond to potentially make somebody happy to get another role, but that's only increasing the amount of work that they're doing for the same pay.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to your point, when we treat employees with respect and dignity, we get so much more in return. We need to get back to humanity. We need to decolonize the way things have gone, because I think we've gotten into this tunnel vision of how things are supposed to go, and that decolonization process and figure out exactly who we are and why we do things is a lost art. We need to unlearn so many behaviors and it's daunting. But the only way that we're ever going to be able to change things is by understanding those mistakes that we've made along the way and being willing to actually go in and dive deep and rebuild in a more inclusive, compassionate, heart-centered capacity.
I love that. Clearly what we're doing, it's not working, right? And so, the methods that we've had that have, we feel like, well, before the pandemic it was this and that, but the fact is we're not before the pandemic, right? Where the pandemic has happened and COVID-19 is still with us, let's be honest about that. But we're in a different world now, and people have different needs, or we just need to be more sensitive to the needs that people have had all along. And so, trying to return to a world of this is how it used to be, people just need to get over it. We're living in a different place now, where organizations, where they're looking to the organizations to support them. So I appreciate that. So I know that we're getting to the end of our time here. I want to ask you one last question. Is for the folks who are listening, and there may be folks who are dealing, whether it's with mental health challenges in their job search, or maybe they're employed right now thinking about leaving, and they're dealing with mental health challenges, and they're just trying to do the best that they can. What's one final piece of advice that you'd like to share with them?
That they're doing it. We fail to acknowledge a lot of times that we are doing the best that we can. Even with me, like today, I was having an extreme bout of depression. I'm, not in a good place job wise. And I have what I talk about when it comes to my spouse that is what I'm actively going through. And one of the things that I had to realize that was brought up to me recently and has been really my only saving grace that has gotten me through is that for everything, there's a start, middle, and end. And if you've been going through it for a while, then you're probably closer to the end than you are to the beginning.
Mm.
And that little bit of acknowledgement can sometimes be the hope that you need to make it to the next day. Uh, that invoke Kamala, sorry.
He's like, so just want to put that in and vote Kamala Harris. And so I want to say thank you. I appreciate that perspective that, if you're in the trenches right now and you have been, you're probably closer to the finish line than you think. And so just having that little piece of hope to keep you going. And so I want to say thank you so much, Dan, for such a rich conversation. I appreciate your vulnerability and just being open to sharing your perspective with us. Think differently. I love the shirts. And so for those who may want to just get in touch with you, to talk with you, work with you, how can people do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is my number one source where you could connect with me. I'm very rarely on Twitter. I still don't know the entire purpose of Threads. I'm on Instagram, but LinkedIn is the direct way. If you need support, I do individual consulting, uh, but it's more high level, and I'm always live. There's also, for those that are interested, there's a free neurodiversity event at the end of August. I'll be speaking out about being a neurodiverse parent with an autistic child. So you actually met Brooklyn. She is on the spectrum, and I was scared to death to be a parent because I thought my neurodiversity was going to get in the way, and it wound up being one of the greatest blessings that I have. So there's plenty of ways to get in touch with me. I don't leave people alone. So if you're having an issue and you need to vent, let me know. But what I'll tell people is this: so many people want to provide advice. It's okay to tell people you just need somebody to listen.
Mm.
That is a huge thing. Be empowered to let people know how you best need to be heard today.
Love that. I love that. Sometimes you don't need the pat on the back and all the advice. You just want somebody to listen to you. So that's a perfect place to end tonight's conversation. Thank you so much, Dan, for being here. I felt like I've learned a lot, and I'm just so glad that you were willing to come and share this with us, share your heart with us in this conversation. And thanks to you all who stayed on for 47 minutes with us in this amazing conversation. Dan told you how to get in touch with him on LinkedIn. He's willing to listen and support you, and I am as well. You can always find me on LinkedIn or via my website, rockcareer.com. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Career Climb. And so until next time, you guys take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next week.